So my next topic is root damage, okay? And this is, again, something that we see commonly on construction sites. We've been doing research on this for a number of years, and I'm going to go through some of that research to show you what we've been doing. So I'm going to start off with our tree and a little bit of wind and what exactly those roots are doing. So we're applying a force to that, to the crown of that tree. It's going to be displacing this trunk. We're going to have that displacement, that force is being transferred to the soil, and it's going to be transferred two ways basically. One is in this downward direction, compression if you will, and the other, the roots are going to be acting in tension. That is, all these fine roots out here are going to be acting, if you will, like an anchor on a boat. They're going to grab onto those soil particles and work in tension. Again, this is like our anchor line where the tree is trying to pull this, or the wind is trying to push the tree that way, but these fine roots will anchor it. So again, working in two directions, compression and tension. The compression tends to be just close to the trunk, and once we get a little bit further away, again, we're working in tension again, where these fine roots are anchoring it to soil particles, and the root in between, that lateral root, is acting as an anchor line to keep it from moving, okay? And that's what's keeping the tree upright. So we've got two different types of tree failures associated with roots that we're concerned about. The names probably aren't the best, but they're the ones we use. One we call root failures, and the other we call soil failures. So soil failure is characterized by this root plate lifting up. The soil was wet, so it wasn't really a flood, it was just heavy rain, okay? And that will change the shear strength of soil, which is going to reduce that anchorage ability. We classify this as a soil failure because that root plate lifted up, and the breakage was in the smaller category of root size. Number one thing that's associated with this type of failure is the weight of the root plate. So if you know the weight of that root plate, you could predict this. The next factor when they start doing regressions, okay, these are the factors that come up. The root strength on the windward side, the root strength on the leeward side, okay, and basically they're pretty similar numbers. So again, those could probably be calculated, okay? You can probably determine the strength of those roots. And then the fourth factor is the frictional properties of the soil. And that's a great one, but it changes. It changes with soil moisture. So what they've given us are four factors here, and we can maybe measure two of them. So what they've given us is nothing. Yeah, useless. Yeah, so exactly right. So they know a lot about this, but we don't know anything about this. Certain wet areas are going to be more prone to this sort of failure. Can I pick out a tree, which tree in a group in that low area that's going to be wet, which one's going to go first? I can't do it. I don't think anyone here can do it. So while they're looking at this stuff, it's good stuff, it's a good first step. We're really basically nowhere on that one. Moving on then to the root failure thing. Now this one's a little bit different. We had roots on this tree, for instance. The one on the upper right, we can see pretty plainly that there's decay in there. Decay will often get started when roots are cut during construction. It can also happen naturally, somewhat water dependent as well. We can get more decay moving in after saturated soil. And do you remember that drought? When did we have the drought here? Like 10 years ago, there were like 3 years of drought. And then we saw oak trees dying for like 3 years after that. And what we found when we were looking at that was that we were getting those root decay fungi, and especially the armillaria, into oaks. And it was killing root systems. Again, it started during the drought and then when we rebounded with rain, they really started moving in, and we saw the mortality, 1, 2, 3 years after that drought. Well, we've done a lot of research where we've gone in and excavated using that air spade. We've counted roots and we've cut roots, and I'm going to be sharing that with you. But a landscape architect actually asked me this. I'm not sure why he asked me, but so I looked back through the data and came up with a number, and our number is typically 7 to 11 roots is what you're going to find. So if we want to compare the cross-sectional area, square inches, we measure trees 4.5 feet, we call it DBH. Square inches at DBH compared to square inches of roots after we cut them. So you can see my root cuts here. How do those numbers compare? The diameter, 4.5 feet, versus the total sum of all of these. When we actually measured this, what we found was that there's 3 times more cross-sectional area in the roots than in the stem. The tree doesn't know what direction the wind's going to come from. So it's got to be able to handle that in every direction. And now going on to the next point. Well, we also pulled our trees over after we cut the roots and measured the roots. And what we were measuring was just the lateral roots, the roots going out. And again, a little hard to see here, but does the tree have other roots besides those just going out? I can tell you with pretty high confidence that it's 3 times more lateral roots than cross-sectional area, the DBH. We've been doing root cutting at our lab for a number of years, and we've been looking at a couple of things. I think this one probably pertains most to you, which is linear root cuts. So if we're putting in a road or a sidewalk, or we're putting in pipes or wires, you're going to be doing linear cuts. And one important question I think that we need to answer is how close can we get to that tree without destabilizing. And then we also looked at individual root cuts at the trunk. So those root cuts I was showing you there earlier, that was individual root cuts. And this pertains more to things we think like root decay, where you may lose 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 roots. And that's why we were doing that research. So how many roots can we lose without destabilizing a tree? And I'm not going to tell you about this one because it doesn't really matter to you. What's the best way to assess root loss? Call an arborist, okay? That's the answer there. So, we see this way too often out there. And we'll come back a few years later and the tree is either dead or in the road. It's just too close to trees to cut the roots like that. But we see it a lot. But the question is, how close can we get? And we know that you're doing stuff where you don't have a lot of space, that you got to cut as close as you can. So that's what we wanted to look at. And this is how we did it. So we took some trees, and these are sort of medium size for our research. We did some smaller and we did some bigger. And we got our stump grinder out, and you can see our lines on the soil here. This is where we're going to cut the roots, okay? And we were doing increments of the trunk diameter. So just to make it so we could upscale the results from small to big. If we did a cut 3 feet away, then it would be really dependent on the size of the tree. But when we're basing it on trunk diameter, we think it's a little bit more universal. And we've done now a lot of different sizes of trees, and I think it is pretty universal. So we're starting out here about 5 times the trunk diameter, and we're going to move in closer with each cut. And I'll show you in a minute how we measured the tree stability. But first I'm going to start with the cut. So this is our stump grinder. You've probably seen these. They're mostly for getting rid of stumps, but we're using them to cut the roots because they're going to cut through very cleanly, pretty quickly. So we're going to saw all the way across there. Then we're going to check the stability of the tree. And we're going to keep working closer and closer to that tree. And then when we get to that tree, we're going to turn the stump grinder around and shave it off just as close as we can get. So we're basically hitting that the trunk face there at the base of the tree, and that's what the tree looks like at the end. So we've cut right up to the face of that trunk, because again, we see this happening especially in cities. And we wanted to test the stability of the trees. So we're using a method that's been around for a while. And the Germans have really refined this to a much higher degree than I'm going to show you here. We're pretty crude compared to what they're doing, but it's basically the same technique. We've got a dynamometer which measures force. We're going to put on these trees a horizontal pull on those trees. And we're going to pull that tree, to a specified angle. And our angle on these is 1 degree of bend. Now, to make this look like real science, we also pulled trees to 1 degree of angle and then pulled them to failure and came up with a correlation between those two. And they correlate pretty well. And that's what the Germans have found as well. So we're just pulling it a little bit off angle. And the reason for doing that is we didn't have enough trees to pull every one to failure. We had to reuse the trees at those different root cut distances. And here's what we came up with our willow oaks, that when we were closer than 3 times the diameter, we had a significant change in that force. Okay, so what we'd say here is if we're closer than 3 times dBH, there's a significant reduction in tree stability. So that was with willow oaks. We also tested small red maples and large red maples using basically those same techniques. With our red maples, we actually were able to cut closer, basically less than 2 times dBH. We had a significant difference in that stability factor. We also did pines. And with pines, it wasn't, you can see some change here, but it really wasn't statistically significant until we were shaving the trunk. Okay, so here's our table with all of them, and it varies a little bit. The willow oak, less than 3, the maple less than 2, and the pine less than 1. Different trees have different root structures.
But they also have different strength.
They do have different strength. And again, we were trying to take that strength variable out by doing the before and after. So this is all related to the before and that took the size factor out too. But you're absolutely right. The woods are of different strengths. So root systems have been classified by, again, a German, pretty far back, 68. And they've come up with 3 general categories of root configuration. The first one in Europe they call a heart root system. We might call it a deep root system. It's composed of lateral roots, the roots growing straight out, and oblique roots growing downward. Okay, so that's a fairly common one. And this is probably what we were seeing on the maples. Our next one is a horizontal, lateral, or again in Europe they call it a plate root system. So the roots growing basically just straight out. Now we are seeing these sinker roots. They tend to be fairly close to the trunk and they do add a lot to stability. But in general we're looking at the lateral roots here. And the last one would be what? The last of 3 types of root systems. Taproot, yeah. That would be our third one. And which of those tree species that we pulled probably had a taproot? The pine, yeah. So with the pine, we were able to cut, basically here because it's got less of its stability coming from the lateral roots and more of its stability coming from that taproot. Those are 3. They do affect the stability, especially with root cuts. Now the next question, can it change? If you have, say, an oak, and it looks like A here to start with, let's say, is it always going to look like A? So there are two factors involved. One is the tree genetics, and the other is the soil. So under what conditions would you get that sort of root system? Yeah, ideal conditions, not compacted down there. The roots are growing, you know, fairly easily without resistance. How about this one? Compaction, water, anything that limits that root development. Root decay works in pretty predictable pattern. It starts at root tips and it works its way toward the stem. And that can occur very commonly over time. Really, when it comes to root decay, we have two positive indicators, two things that if you see it, you've got decay. And I'd like you to know about those, because if you see them on your tree roots, you need to be calling an arborist. Those two things are fungal fruiting structures at the base of the tree and basically seeing the decay. So avoid a hollow, anything that indicates that it's not there. So an animal living in there, but those are the only two positive indicators that we have to deal with, which isn't very many. Oh, likelihood of impact. Oh, which way are trees more likely to fall with a root cut? So we pulled these trees in both directions. So after we cut them, we came back, we pulled them in both directions to compare this. We pulled away from that root cut, we pulled toward the root cut. The trees were pulled when the soil was dry initially. And then we didn't like that answer. So we waited until the soil was saturated, and we did it again. So this is my dedicated crew out there up to their ankles in water, pulling those trees in saturated soil. But what we found was when the soil was dry, it didn't matter. The force was the same to pull them to failure in either direction. Didn't matter. But when the soil was saturated, there was a significant difference. And it was actually pulling toward the cut where we had less force required. So, and I think it's because we're missing those trees that are, the roots, sorry, that are working in compression. So I give you this data, but I'm not discounting what you thought, because I think it's probably more important to know which direction the wind is coming from than which way they're more likely to fail. Things are never all even when we're looking at this sort of thing. They were in my experiment, they were even. But I think in reality that it's going to depend more on the direction of the wind. Okay, so one-sided cut. What's our bottom line? Obviously, we'd like to keep all root cuts outside the drip line. If you can do that, the tree's not going to miss a beat. Is that possible on the sites you're working on? No, the sites are just too small. We think that if you can keep cuts 5 times the trunk diameter away, you're not going to have any problems. We think that's very sustainable. Again, my research is short-term research. We cut, we pulled. What we didn't do is we didn't cut and come back 10 years later and pull. We're doing that now, but that's not something we did. But we think at 5 times DBH, we're pretty good. So why that far? What is going to happen long-term after we do a root cut? Yeah, we're going to get dieback, and again, it's going to be in the terms of decay moving in. And the closer we are to the trunk, the faster the decay is going to move in. We think at that distance, 5 times DBH, you're not going to get much serious decay moving into those roots at all. Roots are very, very good at compartmentalizing. They're a much better compartmentalizer than most branches. So if you're out there, you're good for a long time. We think that's very sustainable. 3 times DBH is as close as I'd ever want to recommend. Okay, at that point, closer than 3 times DBH, you're looking at some potentially significant changes in stability. Which trees? it's going to be hard to tell because we don't know that root configuration. That's sort of the worst case scenario, that we could change our stability at 3 times. And we also know that at this distance, we're probably a little bit more likely to get decay moving in. And you know, I don't know if it's a real good indicator. We haven't really studied it. But one thing to look for is if you are doing these root cuts, look for heartwood. So if you're exposing the heartwood, you're much more likely to get decay moving in. So after the fact, if you want to see, was that a sustainable cut, look for the heartwood. And if there's no heartwood, then probably the root will compartmentalize pretty well. But if you cut into the heartwood, that wood cannot respond, okay? It's basically dead, and decay then can move into it. So after the fact, you can tell a little bit. But when we get within that 1 to 1.5 times DBH, and you saw the variability in the data, okay, some species are different, you got to start thinking about, well, maybe we shouldn't be keeping that tree up if there's a target. And that's sort of a whole other issue, is the target. But when we're in these ranges, most trees are going to be affected. There's going to be an instant stability change, and we're probably going to see that root decay move in. All my work's in the Journal of Arboriculture. You can put my name in or just do root cuts in Journal of Arboriculture. It's free after the first year, so it's easy to access. It's the International Society of Arboriculture. The website is isa-arbor.com, and you go to the publications, and it's in there. Okay, individual root cuts. So these big red maples, we came in and we took off 1 root at a time, and then we pulled them to measure the stability of those trees. We took this little cookie out of there so we could measure that square inches thing, so I could impress you with that number, and also to make sure it was severed, to make sure there was no connection there. We took them off of 50% of the root flare, and this is what it looked like. The different colors on there are indicating our different treatments. And we also tagged each root so we could come back, because we knew the paint would fade, and look at those different treatments. And this is the data, and let me just explain this. So this is percentage of the roots cut, and again, we went around 50% of the circumference. So you'd think most trees we would have cut 50% of the roots. But we've got some outliers up there. One tree, we went around 50% of the circumference, and we took off 90% of the roots, meaning that there's only like 1 root on the other 50% of the tree. And that's an issue with tree roots. They're not necessarily evenly distributed around that tree. Let me also point out something over here. So this is 1 root being removed. And this is our change in force, basically our change in stability. With one tree, we took off 1 root, and it changed the stability by 5%. Another tree, we took off 1 root, and it changed the stability by almost 25%. And again, this is a real problem for us. That is a lot of variability in the data. So, you know, we can look at our average here, and it's a pretty linear thing, that if you take off 1 root, you're going to lose 10% of the stability. You take off 2 roots, you're going to lose 20% of the stability. But there's a lot of variability to that data. The correlation was good, but that's a lot of variability. So individual root cuts, highly variable. 5% to 25% change in stability with 1 root. So best not to cut any roots at the trunk, but sometimes you have to. Thank you. You're welcome. And you know, basically what our guidance is, if we've lost more than 1/3 of the roots, we think the likelihood of failure has gone up significantly. And if we're to that 50% or more root loss, it could fall down with even moderate winds. So there aren't always indications above. We don't always have dieback in these sort of cases. We just looked at one, a lady killed, the tree came down, we could see 3/4 of the roots were decayed. No indications in the crown. That's why we like to keep those root collars clean. Look for fungi, look for decayed roots. Those are only positive indicators. People die because of this stuff, so be careful with it. Okay, so limitations to our research. We were doing a static pull. That's not how trees move in reality. So this is some research from Ken James where he put movement meters basically on the tree. And he's looking at where the trunk moves. So the trunk started here, but as the wind is blowing, it's moving in almost a random pattern. So that's how trees move. It's not back and forth. It's a random pattern like that. So we didn't take that into account, and that's a limit. Also, as I was saying, trees will compensate for that loss of strength over time. This tree has done a pretty remarkable job. It's got this big decay cavity here. It's missing some roots, but it has really compensated with that by putting this big roll of wood around. So we don't know really how much compensation we need, but we do have some general rules on how much decay is acceptable. And so the response growth is important. We also have to look at the size of the crown. A real small crown is going to have less load than a big crown. So a lot of things like that are fairly simplistic research doesn't take into account. And this one is published in Arboriculture and Urban Forestry with all those details. Okay, any questions on any of that before we, if you want, go to the next topic?